Okay, now for the good news. South Carolina in 2017. We're going to present our economic forecast, and that's going to be delivered by Dr. Joey von Nessen, who is a research economist in the Division of Research in the Moore School, where he conducts economic impact analyses, forecasts, survey research, and other applied work in regional economics for the state of South Carolina and beyond. In the 7 years that Joey's been with us, he's authored dozens of analyses for the public and private sector, as well as for our university. He's going to today present an economic outlook for the coming year focused on our state. And as you're going to see, we've got a lot of momentum going into the next year. We had a very good year, as I said at the beginning of our remarks, in 2016. So without further ado, let me turn over the podium to Dr. von Nessen.
All right, I'm going to try not to blast you. Here we go. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very much again for being here today. I'm going to step out a little bit from behind the podium. My name is Joey von Nessen. I'm a research economist here in the Moore School of Business, and I'm going to talk more about what's happening locally in South Carolina over the next 20 minutes or so, and talk about what we've seen in 2016 and what we're expecting going forward in the new year. And I think a good way to really summarize this, really summarize what South Carolina looks like right now, is to talk about it from the perspective of a paradigm shift. Because that's really what's happening right now, both at a national level and at a local level. Of course, we have a new president coming in, but also we have a new potential governor coming in 2017. So Lieutenant Governor McMaster looks to be the successor to Nikki Haley. And so the economic landscape is changing a bit as well. And so I want to hone in on that. And I think to really address this paradigm shift, where we're headed, there are three major points that I want to share with you over the next few minutes that really captures this, I think, fairly well. So the first is that we're seeing economic growth leveling off in South Carolina. That's fairly unique in this expansion. And what do we mean by leveling off? Well, if we look back over the past 7 years in this current economic expansion, going back to 2010, we've seen a steady acceleration of growth every year. So 2011, we saw a better rate of growth in South Carolina than 2010. 2012 looked better than 2011, and so on. And 2016 was really the first year where we broke with that trend and our growth started to level off. And so that's different this year, and it plays into how we're going to see 2017. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Secondly, a tightening labor market. This is another critical paradigm shift that we're seeing in South Carolina. A tighter labor market just means that we have relatively low unemployment right now, as we've already heard. South Carolina's employment rate is at 4.7%, and so that's going to have some implications for workforce development in 2017. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, strong housing demand. The housing sector has become a much bigger player in terms of our overall economic growth in the state. And I'll talk about that more as well. So those are the three components of this paradigm shift. So let's talk about each one. Let's start out by talking about the leveling off of our economy. What does that mean? How do we see that? What's the evidence? Well, the best way to take a look at this is to track what's been happening with employment growth over the past several years. And here we can see what's been happening going back to 2011. And this is the single best indicator that we have for overall economic growth in South Carolina or in any local region, looking at employment growth. So that's why we focus on it so often. And you can see very clearly the pattern, the acceleration of growth that we've seen over the last several years, how that's really leveled off in 2016. I can put a couple of bars on there, a couple arrows to make that more clear. And so the obvious question then is, why is this happening? So our growth peaked at about 3% in 2015. It's been about 2.5% in 2016, just to put some specific numbers to it. And there's a very direct set of reasons why this is happening. It's a very logical process. Two primary reasons. Number one, we've seen slower overall global growth, particularly in China during the first half of 2016, an overall global slowdown. And secondly, and more importantly, I think, we've seen a significant appreciation of the U.S. dollar. And that has significant implications for our state, given that advanced manufacturing is driving much of our growth. And what does an appreciation of the U.S. dollar mean? It just means that our exports are more expensive from the perspective of foreign consumers. So when you have overall lower global demand, you see an increase in price, effectively, for one of your major industries. That's going to lead to a decline in demand for exports. And then that subsequently translates into a decline in overall advanced manufacturing. Now, when we say decline, we mean decline in the growth rate. We're still growing in advanced manufacturing is still very strong, as I'm going to point out, but we see a decline as a result of the decline in the demand for exports, and of course that has a ripple effect in other industries, most notably transportation and trucking, which is a very significant part of the supply chain. So let's look at and see if we can find some evidence for each of these. This graph shows us the foreign exchange rate between China and the U.S., and again, it's not like this is subtle. It's a very clear appreciation of the U.S. dollar. You see a strong change or structural break in this trend beginning in 2015 and continuing through the current year. If I showed you a picture of the exchange rate with the euro, you would get a very similar looking picture. So this is, it's not a subtle pattern. We're seeing a dramatic change, certainly within the last 12 to 18 months. And this is translating into a reduction, again, in export activity. We can see this most clearly if we look at the cargo volume that is being shipped outside of the Charleston port. So they track data on this regularly that they make available, that we keep tabs on, and it's a good way to get a sense of what global demand looks like and how we see these implications for South Carolina's economy. And once again, you can see a very clear change in 2016. This is the growth rate of export volume as reported by the Ports Authority. You can see that it's basically zero if we look year-over-year numbers in 2016. But look at what that's coming off over the previous 3 years. So from 11%, 6%, 8%. So bit of a drop off there. Now this is a growth. So we've seen, again, a sizable increase that's really leveled off in 2016, a very clear result of the appreciation of the U.S. dollar. And here's how we can see it translating into our industry growth overall: manufacturing and transportation and utilities. Again, transportation and trucking, a major supplier for manufacturing. So we see those two very much tied together. And again, if we look at sort of these red bars here versus the blue, red represents what's been happening over the last year. Again, positive growth, but overall at a slower rate than what we saw in 2015. So I think a very clear story about what's happening, very clear picture as to why this growth is leveling off in South Carolina. Now, an important caveat to this. Just because we're seeing a leveling off and an overall leveling off of growth in manufacturing does not mean that manufacturing isn't doing well. Very, very important caveat. Because we can see here that if we compare this green line, which is South Carolina's overall growth rate, and compare that to transportation equipment manufacturing or advanced manufacturing, that is tires, the automotive sector, the aerospace sector, it's been doing very well relative to the state overall, consistently growing ahead of the state's average and pulling the state's average up. It's been a major driver for our growth in South Carolina. And even when it's dropped off here, you can see as of the most recent data point, it's still leading the state average. So it's still a major driver for South Carolina, and it's still been a major player in 2016. And that just shows, I think, the strength of the advanced manufacturing sector in South Carolina, that even with the appreciation of the dollar, even with the hit it's taken, it's still a major driver for our state. And as you can see, growth had been averaging about 6%, dropped to about 4% where it is now, but still significantly ahead of the state average. So I don't want you to take this away, or I don't want you to take away the message that advanced manufacturing isn't doing well, but it has been affected by the appreciation of the U.S. dollar. But those are two very different things that's important to keep separated. So what else has been driving growth in South Carolina in 2016? Advanced manufacturing is certainly one, transportation equipment manufacturing. But there's several other industries as well that have been leading the way. This tracks our growth going back to 2015. One is construction, which I'm going to come back and talk about here in a moment. But we can see that certainly over the last 12 to 18 months, construction has been a major player in South Carolina's economy. as well as professional and business services, which is the other major sector that's been growing in 2016. Now, this is a broad super sector, encompasses a number of different related industries. But the important thing about professional and business services is that it is so broad and that we're seeing growth across the board, whether we're looking at more highly technical positions that require more advanced education, or whether we're looking at more entry-level positions or support positions. In both cases, we're seeing pretty strong, robust growth. And that's incredibly important. And we normally only see professional and business services growing at a fairly aggressive rate in a booming or a fairly healthy economy. So this is an incredibly positive sign for our state, certainly as we move into 2017. The other major sector growing, healthcare. So we've heard a bit about healthcare already. We can see the trend line here that it's been steadily bringing up the state average, and I think that's going to continue to increase, of course, as we see the population continue to age, the baby boomers age. So healthcare is certainly an important part of our state's economy, as it is for the U.S. as a whole. So the other major drivers for the state's region. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's happening regionally. So we've talked about the major sectors. What's happening throughout the local areas in South Carolina? Well, it turns out that the coastal regions of the state are really our shining stars this year. So areas like Myrtle Beach, Hilton Head, Charleston, Rock Hill as well, although that's not graphed here, but it's primarily the coastal regions of the state, and Charleston in particular. And that comes back to construction that I alluded to before. Housing markets are doing incredibly well in 2016, and so we're seeing the implications of that along the coastal regions of the state. A little bit less so we're seeing in the upstate, the Greenville-Spartanburg region. That's been driving our growth for the last several years, but being so heavily concentrated in advanced manufacturing, we've seen that taper off just a bit. So what is our outlook for 2017? For employment growth in South Carolina, we're anticipating growth that's comparable to what we've seen in 2016, specifically a slight marginal increase from our 2.5% rate of growth that we've seen this year to about 2.7% next year. And when we look ahead to 2017, an important question is, if we were to expand, if we were to get to 3% growth or 3.5% growth, where would that come from? And right now, we're not seeing a specific industry that's likely to expand to the point where that could pull the statewide average up. So even though our economy is very healthy right now, we're not seeing any particular industry that's likely to get us to the next level of growth, at least in the short run, going into the new year. So that's point number one, major paradigm shift, in that we have leveled off. We are not seeing this increase in our overall growth rate. And I think a good way to describe that is simply that we're on cruise control. We've been accelerating, right? We've been in the acceleration lane, and now we've hit cruise control, and we're growing at a fairly constant rate. Very healthy rate, a robust economy in our state, but once again, we are not expected to accelerate to a new high in 2017. Point number two, with respect to this paradigm shift, what else are we seeing in South Carolina going into 2017? We're seeing a tightening labor market. Now, what do we mean by that? What is a tightening labor market? It simply means that unemployment is low, relatively low, and employers are struggling more to find qualified workers, to find a qualified workforce. And that's very important. So we can see this easily if we look at the unemployment rates and track them back over time, going back to 2010. You can see that we've seen a steady decline. The U.S. rate now at 4.6%, South Carolina at 4.7%. And notice that when we look at the South Carolina rate, historically it's been consistently above the U.S. rate overall, but that difference really has collapsed over the past 12 to 18 months. And you might hear the term full employment. You've heard that already today. And economists tend to begin to talk about this concept of full employment when we see the unemployment rate fall below 5%. Now, economists generally don't agree on where that point is, but you'll never hear anyone say we're at full employment when the unemployment rate is above 5%. And that just means that full employment just means that most people who are looking for work are able to find a job. Not in every case, but in most cases there. So what is that doing? What is a low unemployment rate doing? Well, it's boosting wage growth. Why? Because when workers are in higher demand and they're more scarce, we see a rise in wages that employers are willing to pay. And so this looks at average hourly earnings in South Carolina, again, over the last several years. And going back to 2015, you can see somewhat of an erratic but fairly consistent growth over the last 12 months or so. And our current rate at 4.4% is about at the highest level that it's been in this expansion period, going all the way back to 2010. And within South Carolina, this is primarily concentrated in the regions, as you would expect, where we're seeing the most employment growth, right? Because we see more employment growth, we see more demand for labor, so naturally you're going to see more increases in hourly earnings. And in fact, that's what turns out to be the case here. If we look at Charleston, you see a plus 6% change over the last year. Myrtle Beach, about 5.5%. Those are the only two regions of the state that have seen growth above, or only two major regions of the state that have seen growth above the state average there of 4.4%. So very direct implication here, or very direct cause and effect relationship between job growth, where it's most aggressive, and the implications for overall income or wage gains. So our forecast for total personal income growth going forward into 2017. Once again, we're continuing to expect more robust gains going into the new year, comparable to what we've seen in 2016. Specifically, our forecast for personal income growth about 4.8% going into the new year, which again is comparable to what we've seen in 2016. Now, here's where we get to the heart of why we're in this paradigm shift. So we've talked about the fact that unemployment is low, but think about it from the perspective now of an employer, and think about as we move ahead. If you're in a very tight labor market where it's hard to find qualified workers, why is that important for future growth? Because as we move ahead, if we want to get to 3%, if we want to get to 3.5%, or pick any number that you like, we have to see an industry drive it. We have to see firms drive that expansion where they're seeing the demand, and they've got to be able to expand with workers, with qualified workers. So in an economy that's fairly healthy, if we want to continue to expand going forward, then a skills gap becomes very problematic to the extent that we have one. And that's something that we have to focus on and address. And we do have evidence that a skills gap exists in South Carolina, and this is going to be critically important going forward in a fairly healthy labor market if we want to continue to move growth to the next level and get out of cruise control mode and accelerate to a new high. One way we can measure this is by this wonderfully named index called the U.S. Skills Gap Misery Index. But what it basically does, it's very simple. It just matches up job openings, the job openings rate, with the number of people who are either unemployed or underemployed. Right? So the extent to which those two match up fairly well, the misery index is going to be low. It's going to be fairly high when that's not the case. Pretty straightforward, right? Because we're just trying to match up workers with open positions. So that's jumped up during the Great Recession. And as you'll notice, we haven't really seen a whole lot of declines here. Now, this is at a U.S. level. I'm going to show you what it looks like at the South Carolina level in just a moment. But the bottom line here is, given how healthy the economy is right now, we would expect for this to be lower. We would expect for it to be lower. And the fact that it's not indicates that we have a skills gap in the workforce that we need to address. If we look at it in South Carolina in particular, it looks a little bit different. This is what we call the Beverage Curve, which is another way that we can illustrate what's happening. But basically, it compares the same thing. In this case, more South Carolina-based data. And we look at the South Carolina unemployment rate and compare that to the job openings rate. I don't think you can see that on the y-axis there. But it's a very similar comparison. And here, just look at any given unemployment rate in South Carolina. So take 6%, for example, and compare the sort of the green line to the blue line. And so what that tells us is for any given level of unemployment, in our current expansion period, we have a higher job openings rate than we did previously. Again, what does that tell us? It gives us evidence that we have a skills gap in South Carolina, and that's going to be something that, once again, we need to address going forward if we want to get growth to a new high. We can also see this demographically. So if we look at trends with movers versus non-movers into South Carolina, one of the things that we hear anecdotally, is that employers are sometimes having to bring workers into South Carolina to help meet demand, particularly higher skilled workers, more executive level positions. So we can look to see if there's evidence for whether or not that's true. And we can see at least we have some indication that might be the case. If we look at movers over the last 12 months that have come into South Carolina versus non-movers, so just current South Carolinians, these are between the ages of 25 and 65. What do you notice here? Well, in the red here, we have the percentage that have an associate's degree or higher. So what you can see, about 45% of movers over the last 12 months that have come to South Carolina between 25 and 65 have an associate's degree or higher, compared to about 35% for non-movers. So some evidence there that people coming in, again, of working age, tend to be more highly educated. And we can break that down by occupation as well. So once again, movers over the last 12 months are more likely to be working in management, more likely to be working in engineering, significantly more likely to be in the military. Now, for the military, it's across the board, right? So there are a number of different occupations there, but as we all know, South Carolina has a significant military presence with about 8 major military installations. So it should come as no surprise that people moving to South Carolina are more likely to be working in the military than those that are not. But the bottom line here is that we do see that evidence of a potential skill shortage in South Carolina. A final way to take a look at this in terms of a changing labor market and ways that we're seeing that manifest itself is if we look at initial unemployment insurance claims in South Carolina. Now, if you're looking for a good leading indicator for what's going to be happening, this is one I would highly recommend that you track on a regular basis, because this sometimes gives us information about changes in overall economic activity. Because when people are laid off, start filing for unemployment insurance claims, that gives us a sign that perhaps the labor market is slowing down a bit. It gives us a head start on recognizing that. But as of right now, we can see that initial unemployment insurance claims really are at their lowest point, going all the way back to 2000, actually lower. And look how dramatically they've fallen over the last several years. So close to 14,000 per week back in 2010, dropped to about right around 2,000, 2,200 or so as of 2016. So to really give you a good flavor for what this implies for 2017, just think about it from the governor's perspective. So Haley, when Governor Haley came into office in 2011 versus when McMaster comes into office, we think in 2017. In 2011, she's coming in. We're just coming off of the Great Recession. We have very high levels of unemployment. Her priority, which is to generate employment opportunities for South Carolinians. In 2017, a very different economic climate, very different set of challenges, because now we have relatively low unemployment, a fairly healthy economy. But the question now is, how do we encourage growth going forward? So that skills gap, making sure that we can match workers with jobs that are available, qualified workers, becomes ever more important as we move ahead. So a very different landscape today than where we were just a few years ago. Our forecast for the unemployment rate for 2017, we anticipate that we'll continue to see gains, job gains, as I mentioned before, accompanied by increases in the size of the labor force. We anticipate that more people will recognize that and see that wages are rising, that there are more job opportunities. They will come back into the to the labor force. And so we'll continue to see a decline in the overall unemployment rate. We expect a marginal decline to about 4.5% this time next year, down from where we are now at 4.7%. So that's point number 2. So point number 1, once again, is that we've leveled off in terms of our overall rate of economic growth in South Carolina, which is very different from what we'd seen in previous trends. Point number 2 is that we have a tightening labor market, which has implications for future economic growth, particularly if we want to move away from a more cruise control scenario to accelerating to a new high, and certainly a new challenge as we see a new governor coming into office. And then finally, we've had very strong housing demand. I've alluded to this already, but this is somewhat unique for South Carolina over the last year. Because housing growth has been fairly weak in South Carolina up until this point. We can clearly see construction as a standout along the coastal regions of the state. Particularly if we look at Myrtle Beach and Charleston, you can see how construction's been growing relative to construction in South Carolina as a whole. And again, this is fueling why the coastal regions of the state have done so well this year relative to other regions of South Carolina. Secondly, we can see that this is, as I mentioned, a fairly new phenomenon. So if we go all the way back to 2011, look at your green line there in construction, you'll notice that growth has fairly consistently been lagged behind the overall growth rate for South Carolina as a whole. Now, this relationship tends to be true. Here we're looking at employment, but we can look at permit growth, we can look at housing starts, we can look at the employment to permit ratio, which is a good indication of supply relative to demand in the housing industry. And by most of these measures, we see that construction has been lagging job growth. And what does that do? That leads to a pent-up demand. More people are working, more people are getting jobs, but they haven't been buying houses. But now that we reach a tipping point where we're beginning to see increases in overall wage growth, that's leading to more consumer spending, more disposable income, which translates into more housing demand. So once again, a very straightforward story here, but it's one that we have really seen come to fruition in 2016 that we're building on from 2015, when we really began to see construction, again, begin to be a major player in our overall growth and outpace the state average. We can also see this when we begin to look at regional competitiveness. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I do want to mention the fact that even though construction is doing well in South Carolina right now, we're still doing, when we compare construction growth in South Carolina to construction growth at the national level, we're still behind by that measure. So what this tells us here, this just looks at for each industry, this just graphs the difference between each industry's growth rate in South Carolina versus the national average. So for construction on the bottom left here, it tells us that construction is growing at about 1.7 percentage points slower in South Carolina than it is for the national average. So even though construction is doing well, we're still falling behind or growing at a slower rate than the national average, which again gives us a reason to be optimistic for 2017 that we'll continue to see housing demand thrive. And by the way, notice who's on the right side. Who's leading the way? It's durable goods manufacturing. And the more general manufacturing category is right there with it. So we have a very strong competitive advantage in advanced manufacturing, getting back to automotive manufacturing, aerospace, tires. So this is still a major driver of our economy. And the appreciation of the U.S. dollar, yes, it's put a damper on growth in 2016, but this is still a very strong component of our economy. And of course, transportation and utility also in red there, which supports it. And then finally, what about the ongoing stimulus effects from the flood? What about the stimulus effects from Hurricane Matthew? What do we mean by that? Well, this is another short-term stimulus that we are seeing in South Carolina right now, and it's a stimulus that we're likely to continue to see going into the new year. So after we had both natural disasters, we see a rebuilding phase that takes a significant amount of time to be realized. We're still seeing spending coming into South Carolina through disaster relief in various forms. That's not going to go away anytime soon. That takes a while to come through, be processed, and be spent in the local economy. But make no mistake, those are dollars that are being spent, creating jobs and incomes for South Carolinians. And we're going to really see that happen to continue on into the new year through Hurricane Matthew. So this is a stimulus effect that will take some time, that will have real effects for the construction industry. Now, that's not to say that we're going to be better off by any means because of the natural disaster, but it does provide a short-term stimulus and is going to affect housing in a positive way on the margin going into the new year. So I'll leave you with this. This is a set of leading indicators from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia in terms of what the outlook looks like for the next 6 months. According to them, they rank each of the states in terms of various indicators. But the bottom line is they compile it into a leading index figure, and so we can compare all the states here. Wyoming, interestingly enough, is actually number 1. Blue is good in this case. And the dark green states are really that second tier. So South Carolina is still in a very strong position as we move ahead, as we move into the new year. So going forward, we expect continued strong, robust growth, job and income gains. Again, not at a higher level than we saw really in 2016. We don't see a particular industry driving that growth at this point. But 2017 still looks pretty good right now. And again, we've seen a healthy economy throughout this year, and we expect that to continue into 2017. Thank you very much for your attention.
We have some time for some questions. Over here, Phil.
First of all, thank you for some good news. We very much appreciate it. From a construction viewpoint, could you just go a level deeper maybe in terms of commercial construction, multifamily, single family, and just talk to which one of those is driving the most activity?
New construction has been driving the most, primarily residential. And that's what's changed really in the last year or so. We had previously seen growth in remodeling activity, but now it's transitioning more to new construction. And I think the reason that we've seen that transition is because in a down economy, homeowners especially tend to remodel rather than buy or move, just because that's more practical, more affordable. And so that's a major shift that we've seen in the last year or so.
Joey, what makes you think people are going to come back into the labor force that have dropped out of the labor force, which may explain our excellent unemployment rate? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing to tell me that the labor force is going to increase?
Well, the absolute numbers are increasing. So our labor force participation rate is still at historic lows. But the labor force, when we look at the numbers in South Carolina, really beginning in 2015, they began increasing. So throughout this year, we've seen a growth rate in the labor force. So it's already happening. And we've seen that coincide largely with when we begin to see more wage gains. It needs to be higher, but it has turned around, and we've seen a transition.
People, middle-aged people, or people not retiring?
It's working age people. I can't say offhand the percentage in terms of young versus middle age, but when we just look at working age, 25, 54, 25 to 65, we are seeing an increase in that area as well. So it is working people.
If I could just add to that, what's driving people back into the labor force, we're seeing higher wages now,
right,
higher incomes, and we hadn't seen that in a few years. So that draws people, sometimes in families that have two potential working partners. One is only working, and then now the other one's coming back in. We're seeing that with people across the labor force.
Right.
Okay. I don't know where to go.
Go to Grant. Yes, and come over here.
Joey, go back to your slide on wage growth and average hourly earnings, broken down by the metro areas. You said most of the metro areas up, except for Columbia. So Columbia down.
Right.
What do we attribute that to? What's going on with our local wage growth or lack of wage growth?
I think if we look at the industries that have been driving growth, advanced manufacturing, construction, they've been mainly focused in Charleston, and then advanced manufacturing more in the upstate. And Columbia just hasn't seen as much expansion in those areas.
You did show some growth to business and professional services growth, so that's Columbia.
Yes. But I think we just haven't seen the professional business services expands off of manufacturing, expands off of construction. So again, we just haven't seen that those industries driving as much here as we have in the upstate and in Charleston.
However, we did get a major announcement last week.
That's right.
Of a manufacturer in Richland County, Juicy from Juicy. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Chinese investment?
Chinese investment, yes, right here in the Midlands. So we'll see how that plays out.
Here.
Joey, with the employment growth, so much of your forecast is corresponding to what you think will be organic growth from existing firms versus new firms that are being brought to the state. And what sort of presumptions do you have about the national regime on trade and investment that may impact that ratio?
Well, I think that, first of all, the supply chains are expanding. So we are seeing a lot of smaller, so it's not just these major manufacturers that are coming in. It's about expansion of the existing supply chain, and that's continuing to develop. We've seen that. We've looked at that in aerospace just recently and seen that continue to progress. The professional and business services, I think, supports that as well. Those are a lot of these ripple effects. In terms of from a national perspective, I don't know that, and correct me if you disagree, but I don't think there are going to be as many short-run effects as there will be for 2018 and beyond. I think so two major factors. Number one, if we see additional significant infrastructure spending in terms of the military, that could impact us here in a potentially positive way. Trade, it just depends on the individual specifics, because I think we have to balance the relationship between whether we see a revamping of the supply chain because we see additional costs because we have so many firms that are buying from outside of the U.S., versus whether we see maybe additional investment because we become more attractive from the perspective of foreign investors. So that, I think, is a case-by-case basis. And I think, yeah, skipped over here. I didn't mean to do that.
I was going to say, of course, we've got Volvo coming online, which will increase the manufacturing durable goods. I was just curious if you have an opinion on South Carolina's inability to address our infrastructure and lack of skilled workers. In particular, if you drive from Charleston to the upstate, where all that manufacturing is, or up and down 95, our roads are, and I understand a lot of the large manufacturers are not happy with our road system. Is this going to dampen our ability to bring in any more large manufacturers?
Well, I think it can in terms of branding. I think that's the critical issue there, is that we have good infrastructure, we have a good brand nationally and internationally for advanced manufacturing. And so I think the long-term problems, if we don't have infrastructure that continues to work for businesses, if that word gets out and it damages our brand, that could have a negative
I'll just add to
implication.
that really quickly. We've been debating infrastructure here for years, and how to pay for it is the critical question. Everybody knows we need it. Now we have the Trump administration coming in, and they're talking about a massive infrastructure program too. They've got Republican Congress, they've got a president. They can make that happen, but they're going to run up against the same thing that we found here in South Carolina. How are they going to pay for that? And that's going to make it really different. Infrastructure is expensive. But I'll just add one more thing. One thing we've done right is that inland port. We put the inland port, we've got another one coming in. It's a really smart strategy. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but it's done a lot in terms of moving goods into the interior of the state without putting extra trucks on the highway, I-26 like you're talking about. I don't know how much more capacity we have, though, to expand that. Our rail system is already being taxed as well. Back there.
I'm with the chamber in Hilton Head, and what you're saying is exactly right. We're seeing in our particular community the tight labor market, demanding higher wages, as well as impossible to find housing in the area. So it's exactly what you're saying in our little microcosm. The question is, that's growing pains for us, for our tourism economy. What are you seeing in terms of sector numbers for tourism in South Carolina?
That's a very interesting question, and tourism has actually been down this year, positive but down. And we're struggling to come up with an explanation as to why exactly that's true. Because consumer spending is good, disposable income is up, average wage growth is up. So we've seen some declines, particularly in the second half of the year.
Oh, Hurricane Matthew.
Well, that's part of it, but it started before that too. So I think it's probably a temporary blip, but that is a fairly unusual, hard to explain phenomenon that we're seeing this year.
When you say it's down, it's still growing. It's just not growing
Right.
at the same rate.
Right.
And I think that's what you've probably been seeing in the Low Country as well. Okay, we have time for one more question. For Joey, anybody?
Let's go over here in the back.
Yeah, Joey, you talked about manufacturing employment, but you didn't really talk about output. Is output growing a lot quicker than employment? And what about, does it take a lot fewer people to do the same amount of output in manufacturing? And then I've got a second question, is what are the biggest risks to your forecast?
Short answer is yes. Output is growing. Employment is not. We are seeing more gains in productivity. Manufacturing is one of the few areas where we've seen sizable gains in productivity. That's especially true at the national level. But we, even though we're integrating more technology into manufacturing, we still need workers that are qualified, and that goes back to this the skills gap. Is we training workers to be able to operate machinery and equipment that are more highly technically savvy and can fill these positions that are being created going forward. I think that the threat to the forecast ahead is, number one, what are we going to see in terms of interest rates going up? I think that effect is probably going to be minor. We're talking about another 25 basis points or so. And then, of course, the uncertainty at the national level. What do the first 100 days of the Trump administration have in store? And I think we just have to wait and see on that front.
I'll just add to that the strong dollar. The dollar is strengthening right now. That's going to potentially put a downward effect on our manufacturers. You look at the peso, it's plummeting right now. It makes Mexico much more competitive, no matter what President Trump wants to do. A lot cheaper to produce in Mexico right now, as well as China and elsewhere. And I think we're already seeing the effects of that, the strong dollar, and that will carry forward into 2017. Okay, well, thank you, Joey.
All right, thank you.
Round of applause for Dr. von Nessen. What Joey has provided for us is what we call the short-term outlook for the state's economy. Now we're going to turn to the long-term conditions for prosperity in our state. Our first speaker to address this is Megan Hickman. She serves as Ingenuity South Carolina's executive director, that's a leading organization in Columbia here, focused on competitiveness and prosperity. Prior to joining Ingenuity, Megan spent nearly 6 years working with Senator Lindsey Graham. Before that, she was in the private sector with Stratacom. Megan is a self-proclaimed news junkie and a graduate of the University of South Carolina's Honors College. Please join me in welcoming Megan to the stage.